Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to Students of the Word. This is session number 77. And tonight, we've been, I was kind of breaking my normal pattern last time. Instead of just looking one verse at a time, I was going ahead and looking through the Greek, through the whole rest of our paragraph 13. And I wanted to do that for a couple of reasons. So there are a couple of reasons why I've been sort of shifting in this direction as we've been going along. One of the biggest is that by this time in the epistle, now we're in the second half of the epistle, and in this half of the epistle, John is doing so much building on what he's done before. So there's a lot less, hey, let's figure this out, and a lot more, hey, let's see where we've seen this before. Let's make sure we're connecting all the dots that he's wanting to connect. So that's part of it, that it felt like just kind of going through and seeing if I could parse and identify the main things. Now we can kind of build on that. I'm going to be going back to the beginning of the paragraph and looking at the sort of the movement of ideas there and thinking through how it picks up on the ideas that he has been giving before, because it certainly is feeling through paragraph 12 to some extent, and paragraph 13, I think, to an even greater extent, like we're getting a certain amount of payoff in one sense. That is a lot of the things that he introduced, and that he is, that he introduced originally in the early parts of the epistles, and that he's kind of coming back to and tying all together. There's a lot of that happening in the second half. Now, keep in mind what I was saying before, the way in which things like the shape of things like this, like Hebrew poetry and such, tends to be more circular, I think, instead of just sort of planting a seed at the beginning, which bears fruit at the end. He's just as likely to sort of plant a seed at the end, which then will bear fruit when you go back and start again at the beginning, right? So it's not just that. I wouldn't want to discuss it in a way that makes it sound like I think he was just like he's doing setup in the first half of the epistle, and then he's delivering having set up the message, he's delivering the real message in the second half. It isn't about that at all. But it is about the different sort of parts of the epistle talking to each other. I also want to differentiate between two different things. One is places where I think that he is, okay, so there are two similar things. Sometimes it's the same process, in fact, but one is a place where we can see familiar usage of words, right? When we're seeing the words that he's using, and we're trying to understand as best we can, what does he mean by that? Like, what does this word mean to John? How is he using it? Remember, I've sort of gone through before what in my mind is sort of the hierarchy there, right? Like the best place, the best information we can get on what a particular word, what are the connotations of a particular word or a particular phrase for John, is how it's used in this epistle, right? So that's always the first thing that I'm looking for. When else has that word come up? How else have we seen him use it here in this epistle, right? That's always the top priority. The second priority is how have we seen him use it elsewhere? So let's go back and let's compare to the Gospel of John, and then elsewhere in the New Testament, right? To like among his peers, these other generally Jewish, like Aramaic speaking folks who are writing and who are putting their ideas down in Greek here in the New Testament. And then beyond that to Greek usage outside the Bible. That would be sort of the hierarchy of where I would go in order to try to make sure that we're properly understanding, we're properly contextualizing a particular word. But there are places in John, many places, in fact, in John, where it goes beyond simply kind of us doing word study and becomes much more clearly picking up patterns that John himself is embedding. And I don't mean patterns in any kind of, freaky Dan Brown kind of way. what I mean, the Da Vinci Code and that kind of thing. I'm not. This is not like an Illuminati thing. Um, all I mean is ways in which he raises an idea using a particular word or phrase here, and then comes back to it again later on in a way in which, like, both of the two usages enrich each other. Um, so that goes beyond simply using First John as our top priority and trying to contextualize words to really beginning to see the flow of John's thought and trying to see it, make sure that we can follow to make the internal connections that he seems to be trying to push us to connect. That's certainly one of the things that we're going to be doing here, and that's where you get that the sort of the bearing of fruit, right? Because you can only begin. Thing about patterns. Is that you can only pick up on them down the road, right? Like, first time you see something, you don't know if it's a pattern yet or not. So all you can do is try to pay close attention. And of course, this is one of the primary reasons why we have been going as slowly as we have, right? Because by going slowly and paying attention to every word and phrase in the way that we've been doing, we're now prepared. We're now much likelier to notice. Like that wonderful example, Devora, a few weeks ago, when you remembered the already word, right? When we got up in the beginning of chapter 4 here, right? When we're talking about the Antichrist, um, uh, this is that thing of the Antichrist which you heard is coming, and even now is in the word is in the world, ere, already. And Devora, you remembered that he used the word already, the word ere, earlier on. The true light is already shining, right? And that's a really fun connection. And I do think so. Anyway, looking at some of these connections and beginning to see, like, are there, that probably just a pattern of usage there, though they do seem potentially connected to each other, or to sort of reflect each other, as both of those usages of already seem to be talking about the anticipation, right? The imminence of the coming of the age, right? The true light is already in the world. The Antichrist is already in the world, right? We are already in a day in the closing act of the age. Okay, so let's go back to our paragraph. Thus equipped, let us now return, and we're going to be looking at more than one verse at a time because we've already kind of looked, and we may go back and check again because I'll probably forget stuff and everything. But I want to back up now a little bit and look at the slightly broader patterns here. Okay. Hey, let's do it in English. Then I'll refer back to the Greek. Beloved, let's love one another, for love is from God, and everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. The one who does not love does not know God, because God is love. By this the love of God was revealed in us, that God has sent his only Son into the world so that we may live through him. Okay, now I'm going to stop there. The next section, the next sentences, in this is love, not that we love God. So that's a slightly different motion in that he's going to make in the middle of the paragraph, right? He's sort of defining love, which you'll remember he's done before, but we'll come back to that. So we'll look at how that ties in. But let's start with those first three verses. Now, this time, let's do it in our paraphrased Greek here. Beloved, we should love one another. We should love one another, hoti, because since love is ektutheu, and each of the loving ones, paso agapon, each of the loving ones is ektutheu, has been born, gegenetai ektutheu, has been born of God. So the logical movement of his opening sentence in this paragraph. We should love one another. What? Remember, that's the commandment. Exactly that phrase. Agapomena leilus. Right? So remember that commandment, agapomena leilus, that we ought to love one another? Well, why does that make sense? Why does that make sense? Okay, so now it's Holti. Let's explain this, right? Since agape, love, is ektutheu, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, paso agapon, each of the loving ones. So love itself is ektutheu, and each of the loving ones are born or begotten ektutheu, derived from God. So love is ektutheu, love is from God, and each of the ones who love are from God and know God and have come to know God and are in relationship with God. That goes way back to our, walking with God back at the beginning in paragraphs 2 and 3, right? Okay, so this is the explanation for why we ought to agapomena leilus, why we ought to love one another. Because love is from God, and each of the loving ones has been born from God and knows God. Yeah, so Scott, I agree. The Hotis are confusing. Hoti here, so it's that. The word means that, right? It's just a question of sort of how it's using. And yes, sometimes the interlinear is making choices on our behalf. Now, of course, like in their defense, they kind of have to, right? Now, they have less excuse than somebody who's trying to publish like an actual legible English translation, right? Someone who's trying to actually make English sentences out of it, right? If you're not going to be restricted by making any sense whatsoever in English, it's much easier to translate. You have fewer choices before you if that's what you want to do, but you're right. And for that reason, I don't always love the choices that they make. But yeah, that's why like we agapomena leilus hoti, that. Because that, since that, in that, when we talked about this before, it seemed to me to make most sense that the hoti in this case isn't necessarily a cause, right? Like, in the same sense that like, your being hungry is caused by your not eating food, right? I don't think it's quite exactly that, but it's more like, I think the way I paraphrased it when I just read it was since. We should love one another since love is from God, right? And that's a kind of because, right? I mean, if you say, if your wife says, "Why did you give me this present?" and you say, "Because you're wonderful," that's a kind of cause too, but it's not, again, just a straight up cause and effect kind of cause, right? It's a grounds, right? And that seems to me to be the kind of because here. Why should we love one another? Because love is from God, and each of the loving ones has been born from God and knows God. That's why. So again, the since, to me, it's more like he's not exactly explaining the cause of it as if trying to identify like what virus is causing your symptoms or something like that, right? It's not that kind of cause and effect. What he's saying is we should love one another. Why does that make sense? Right? Why should that be the commandment? It's so funny because, of course, it's one of these things which we're quite used to hearing, right? That is to say, you go to a Christian and say, hey, we should love one another. And in general, like when you are not applying it to specific people, like such as it might be Democrats. But in general, when you say we ought to love one another, most modern Christians are not like, oh, yeah, no, please explain. right? That doesn't make any sense. That we're used to being told that we ought to love, right? And to love one another. Um, but if you think about it, it's a little odd. I mean, it's not completely intuitive why it is that in particular should be part of the core commandment, right? Believe on believe on the name of the son of his son Jesus Christ and love one another. That's it. That's the commandment. That's the commandment. Um, why? Why is it so important? Can't I just, obey God? And isn't that enough? Why do we have to agapomene aleilus? And so again, I think, Scott, it seems to me that what he's trying to do by adding the hoti here, right? That the whole idea is to say, let me tell you why this makes sense. Let me help you to see why. Why agapomene aleilus? Why loving one another ought to flow naturally from the state of things. Why this is not just kind of cool, why this is not just vaguely desirable, but why this should be inevitable. And it's because it's hoti. Love is from God. Love is ektu theou. Remember the weight of that phrase, ektu theou. Love is what God gives to the world. Love is ektu theou. Love is what has God's stamp on it, right? And it's not just that in the abstract, because that's pretty abstract. Love in general, agape in general. And don't forget the discussion we had ages ago now, like 2 years ago now or something. Remember when we were talking about idolatry and mac and cheese? That agape is the maximally generic word for love, right? That in ancient Greek, before the New Testament is written, before people like Paul and John do with the word agape what they do with the word agape, the word agape in Koine Greek was the most, it's like what they would have used for the, what they would have sold ancient tourists. I don't think they actually put bumper stickers like on their chariots or whatever, but like if they did, it would be like, I agape, I agape Corinth or something if they were visiting Corinth, right? Like the I heart New York heart, you'd translate that with agape. Like, if somebody says, hey, do you like mac and cheese? You'd be like, yeah, I like mac and cheese. You'd say agape, right? So it's the most generic, neutral, unspecified form of word for love, which John and Paul are going about investing with massive specific meanings. Anyway, okay, so just saying, so if he had just stopped there, beloved, we ought to love one another because love is from God. Love is ektu theou. Like, that's pretty cool. Like, it's a big statement right there. Love is ektu theou. Love is the thing that God has sent. Love is the thing that comes from God. Love is the thing that is derived from God as if from a parent, right? Love is like the natural offspring of God in the world, right? Still a really profound thing to say. But he doesn't stop there. Kai and paso agapon, each of the loving ones. So he shifts the focus from love, the noun, the vague noun, and I don't just mean in the way that it was used in Greek, but I just mean like you're just waving your hands at the concept of love here. Love is from God, right? But that's super abstract, right? Love is from God. What does that mean when it's at home, right? What does that look like? What is that? How does that function, right? Give me some examples. What do you mean? Well, he goes on to say, paso agapon, each of the loving ones. Let's talk about people, not just love in the abstract. Let's talk about people. And he's doing that thing that he loves to do, where he is defining a group of people, not by who they are, but by what they do. That's what that pos whole present participle construction is all about. Each of the sinning ones, each of the doing righteousness ones, right? We've seen this kind of thing a lot in his constructions. When he is defining a group of people, it's in one sense a generic group of people. He's not talking about like specific people, right? It's a But he's defining that category of people by what they do, by the verb, by what they do, right? So love is ektutheu and passo agapon ektutheu. Um, each of the loving ones is also gigenetai is ektutheu gigenetai. So as so often happens in Greek, the verb comes last, right? Agape ektutheu estin. Estin is, right? The linking verb, right? Kai passo agapon ektutheu gigenetai. He could have said estin there as well, right? He could have said each of the loving ones is from God, which would have put exactly the same emphasis, right? It would have been an exact parallel, and it would have placed exactly the same emphasis on the phrase ektutheu. By using estin, the linking verb, when you put the verb to be in there, you are usually, not in some unusual cases, but usually you're not emphasizing the verb, right? It's what a linking verb, its whole job is just to join together the subject with another noun, an adjective, right? Whatever. That's its job. It doesn't actually do much work on its own. The one exception, of course, is when you're talking about like, and then those things came to be, right? Like when you talk about creation or something like that, then sometimes maybe the verb to be does a little bit more work than that. But normally it's just a linking verb. So again, in the first phrase, hoti he agape ektutheu estin, the estin is just like, it tells you at the end, like, yeah, so ektutheu, that's the business there. Love is ektutheu. So love, ektutheu, that's what's being linked together. Here, same structure, passo agapon in each of the loving ones in place of agape, ektutheu, but then he doesn't end with estin, he ends with gigenetai, has been born of God, has been born ektutheu. So what he does here is sort of shape specifically how we're to be thinking about the phrase ektutheo. When he just says agape ektutheo estin, hey, agape, I should use the article, I suppose. Or else, a native Koine Greek speaker would think I was sounding pretty funny. Hey, agape ektutheo estin. When you just say that, you're just saying love is from God. And it can have, because you're just kind of putting those two concepts next to each other, agape and ektutheo, next to each other, just joined only by a linking verb, you allow them to kind of interact in multiple different potential ways, right? He's not specifying how those two concepts, the prepositional phrase ektutheo and the noun agape, are related to each other, right? Love is ektutheo, from God in multiple senses. From God in the sense that God gives love, from God in the sense that love is derived from God's being, like love is patterned. The fact that anybody loves anything is patterned from God's being. It's from God in the, like, again, in that sort of parental sense, in that like anywhere you see love, you're seeing something that bears a family resemblance to God. Or there are lots of different ways in which we can think about agape, ektutheu, estin. He has some more specific plans, John does, for how we're supposed to think about passo agapon ektutheu gigenetai, right? Because now we don't just get a linking verb. He's not just taking passo agapon on the one hand, each of the loving ones, and ektutheu on the other hand, and just letting them play in the same way that he did in the previous phrase, previous clause, right? Here, he's got a plan. Gigenetai. There's an action verb here. Each of the loving ones has been born ektutheu, from God. So he's definitely thinking now in that like genealogical parental kind of way, We are from God. We are God's children. We have each, I say we, that's aspirational or optimistic, right? Each of the loving ones has been born from God, has that family resemblance to God, right? Um, Kai Gnoske ton theon. Now, this second Kai we can tell is not like the first Kai. So we have two Kais going on in this sentence, right? Agapetoi, beloved ones. We agapomena lelus. We ought to love one another. Hoti he agape ektutheo estin. Kai paso agapon ektutheo gigenitai. Kai genoske ton theon. Now, the first Kai introduced a whole new parallel clause. Love is from God, and each of the loving ones has been born from God, right? As we were just discussing, not a totally equal, like a totally balanced parallel, but that these are two separate ideas which are designed to be parallel is pretty clear. But the second Kai doesn't just introduce a third one that balances with the first two. Kai gnoske ton theon, because this is clearly a compound verb with gigenitai, right? What does each of the loving ones do? Each of the loving ones has been born from God and knows God. So there are two action verbs that he uses here. Gigenitai ektutheu and gnoskai ton theon. And knows or has come to know God. Gnoske, remember, this is the verb that he's been using consistently about coming to know God as in establishing a relationship with him, or other people with us, or other people with him. Remember, this is the verb that he's used when he said, like, the world doesn't know him, right? And so therefore it won't know us. This is so it's been used in that context as well. We first saw gnosko back in paragraph 3, right? You will remember that, I am sure. By this we know we have come to know him, if we keep his commandments. The one who says, I have come to know him, this gnosko, and does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, in him the love of God has truly been perfected. And this is the very first time that the phrase the love of God is used in the whole epistle. Right? So the love of God has been perfected in the one who keeps his word, who keeps his commandments, and who thereby has come to know him. Right? So that idea is explained, we get it, right? Very early on in the epistle, back in paragraph 3. Now back up in paragraph 13. Gegenetai ektutheu kai genoskai ton theon. So we have another pairing, but the pairing is on the verb, right? Again, the verb which agrees with each of the loving ones. They've been born ektutheu, and they know ton theon. They know God. So notice that there are two different elements. Like he's telling us two things, but they're parallel in the sense that they're both true of each of the loving ones, right? He's telling us two things, two separate things about the relationship that each of the loving ones have with God. One is gegenetai ektuthei. It's about where we've come from. It's about the past, right? This is a looking backwards verb. The tense is perfect. An action that is completed, right? Has been born. It's done. We're speaking in the present time of something that is finished in the past. That's where each of the loving ones, each of the loving ones comes from. Ektutheu, being born, ektutheu. But there are two things about the second verb, ginoske. One is its tense. This is not perfect. This is present tense, present indicative active, right? Notice this describes so the first verb talks about where each of the loving ones came from. What is their origin? What is their nature, in a sense? And the second, what do they do? And what they do is gnoske, is know God. So the first thing is the tense, present tense as opposed to perfect tense. The second thing is the construction. You've got gegenetai and then a prepositional phrase. Born ektutheu. Gnoske just has a direct object. Knows God. Knows what? Knows whom? Has come to know whom? Has come to know God. So the first one is an action that describes a thing that happened to them in the past. Each of the loving ones, I mean. The second one is a verb which talks about what they do in the present and to whom, right? What is their relationship with God now? And it is they have come to know him. They are in this present active relationship, ton theon, with God. With the God, ton is a definite article, I know. Okay. So this whole sentence makes a good deal of sense. Notice all of those things. These are all the hoti clause. This is all the since. So why, I don't know. Agapom and Alelus, I'm not sold, right? Like, why should we bother loving one another? Let me explain. We should love one another since love is ektutheo in many different ways of thinking about it. And each loving person has been born from God and knows God. And now here is an example of where we can see this building on that I was talking about, the connecting back, how this, just back to what I was just talking about. Notice how much richer this sounds now. By this we know that we have come to know him if we keep his commandments. The one who says, I have come to know him and does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. We can see and feel the truth of that much more, especially when we know what his commandment is, right? What's his commandment? Agapom and Alelus. That's his commandment. Love one another. We ought to love one another. And so, of course, if somebody says they know God and don't agapom and Alelus, they don't love one another, well, of course they're lying, at least to us, if not to themselves. Because each of the loving ones is from God. Notice how the thing is reversed here. In paragraph 3, how do we know we come to know him? Well, if you say this, you're claiming to know God. But do you really know God? How do you know if you love God? Right? That's the question. And the answer is if you keep the commandments, namely agapom and Alelus, right? If you love one another. So if you're loving other people, then you can have a pretty good idea that you've come to know him, right? Notice how the whole thing, the direction of the whole thing is reversed here. He's not asking, how do we know that we know God? Like, notice that's all implied in the gegenetai ektutheu and gnoske ton theon, right? Of course, each of the loving ones knows God, right? He's not saying who is it that knows God? Oh yeah, people who love. No, he starts with that. Each of the loving ones, right? We should love one another since each of the loving ones has been born from God and knows God. obviously. Do you see what I mean by it's being sort of reversed? But when you look at these two passages together, paragraph beginning opening sentence of paragraph 13 and back to the opening sentence of paragraph 3, see how they talk to each other like that, right? They're talking about exactly the same thing, but they're coming at it from exactly different perspectives. And when you put them together, you see how they all fit together. Kind of awesome, right? Okay. So that's why we should love one another, right? But wait, he's not done. Ho me agapon, the not loving one, the not loving one, uk egno tantheon, has not known God. The not loving one has not known God. Hoti. Now we have to see, Scott, what kind of hoti is this? Is this a similar hoti to the first, to hoti number one? Is it a since that thing? Or is it a more cause and effect? Right? Um, the not loving one has not known God. Hoti, ho theos agape esti. Because God is love. And yeah, I think we can see it is very similar to that first one. Um, because this is not like, why don't they know God? Like, or why don't they not love or something like that? It's like, again, why does this make sense? Why does it make sense that the not loving one has not known God? Right? Um, I mean, if you've got somebody who doesn't love people, right? One of those liars from paragraph 3 or from paragraph 5 when it comes to it, right? Same thing. Paragraph 4, I meant. The one who says he's in the light and yet hates his brother is in the darkness until now, right? Same kind of person, right? If we're talking to that person, to one of those people, then because they're one of the whole May Agapon folks, the not loving folks, the folks who hate their brothers. I'm tempted just to call them haters, but I won't because I think it's important that he's called them May Agapon people, not loving people. Love is what matters, right? Um, the not loving one has not known God. Well, how can you be so sure? Who are you to say who knows God and who doesn't know God? Right? I mean, that seems a big claim. Why does that make sense? How can you be so sure that the not loving one doesn't know God? Hoti, since Hotheos agape estin, because God is love. Duh. Right? That's why. Now notice linking verb, just like I was talking about before. And notice this is like even more open. Ektutheu, from God, is not only a phrase, a prepositional phrase, and so therefore it has more kind of content because it's got a preposition and a noun. So it gives you not only a thing, a noun, but a relationship, which is the preposition, right? So when we had agape and ektutheu joined only by estin, by is, we had I was talking about how open that was. Like we can see that being true in multiple sense. He kind of by using the word is, he just sort of puts those things together and lets them work, right? Lets those two things cook next to each other. This Hotheos agape esti. There it is. I'm going to give you the noun God and the noun agape, and I'm going to put them next to each other and I'm going to back away. Right? That's what John does in the second half of that sentence. And notice how this feels to me like like a kind of mic drop, right? Let me show you what I mean. You'll remember this multi-layered parallel structure that he put into the first sentence, right? We ought to love one another. Hoti, since, let me explain, right? And we get agape, ektutheu estin, kai, paso agapon, each of the loving people, right? Ektutheu gegenetai, kai genoske ton theon, right? It's all this layer within layer, right? Really complicated thing. Um, in verse 8, the next sentence, he comes back and sets up a similar thing. The not loving ones have not known God. Hoti, no, so he's going to set up a similarly like layered and structured thing. No, he just three words. Since God is love. Enough said. Done with argument, right? But you see, linking verbs, it's not quite an equal sign, right? An equal sign is a particular relationship between two nouns. But you know, when you just drop two nouns connected only by the verb to be, it starts to sound like an equal sign, like you can, like those two things are interchangeable. God is love. Not totally interchangeable. If you reverse it and say love is God, you get into the situation that C.S. Lewis warned us that the 20th century was moving towards, right? That is idolatry of love and all that. I'm not denying any of that thing. But you see what I mean? Like, God is love. Like, that's just, God is, and so therefore, God and love are being identified with each other. And that, of course, explains that is the perfect and exceptionally brief Hoti clause to explain what he just said. Why can you be so sure, John, that the not loving one doesn't know God? Why is it that we can look at someone's actions and say, hey, you know, you say that you know God, but you're not loving all these people. You're not loving people much at all. So I think you actually don't know God. How can we be so sure about that? Which is exactly what he was saying, both in paragraphs 3 and 4. The one who says, I have come to know him and does not keep his commandments, namely agapom and aleus, is a liar, and the truth is not in him. Remember how harsh that sounded at first? Like, whoa, dude. Well, because hotheos, agape, estin. God and love are like interchangeable. If you're not loving, then you don't know God. Because if you knew God, you would love. Because hotheos, agape, estin. Because love is essential to the entire nature of God. You can't know God and not love. It's not possible. And notice, of course, how then this encourages us to look at verse 7 now again in a new light. Why should we love one another? Why does that make sense? Because we've been born from God and we know God. And you know what happens when you know God? You become a loving one. Like, that's what it means to know God. That's what it means to be born of God. If you've got God's DNA, love is God's DNA. That's what it means to be ektutheu. Oh, yeah, that's kind of what he started off by saying. Agape ektutheu estin, right? Love is from God. And so we can see, again, a deeper sense in which that's true by simplifying it to its absolutely base form, ho theos agape estin. God is love. En tuto, in this. And by the way, I feel like we should have some kind of a party to celebrate the fact that here in verse 9 of chapter 4, the interlinear has translated in tuto with the preposition in instead of by. Love it. In tuto, in this, if honoralthe, one of our favorite verbs from sentence one, ever since sentence one, I mean, like, and many times afterwards, in this, if honoralthe has been revealed. He agape to theo, the love of God, en hemin, in, not among, in us, in us. Now, it was good while it lasted. Yes, Susan, you're absolutely right, and I shouldn't tease them for it. No, I'm going to carry on teasing them for it. But I agree. They like variety more than John does, is what Susan just said. That is exactly right. We have, in English, we have this tick about not saying the same thing the same way in multiple ways. And if you think that way, you're missing a lot of what John is doing. In this has been revealed the love of God in us. And that in, I'm sorry, that's really important. Now, I think I see what they're going for when they say among us, right? Because like the love of God is among us in the sense that, well, we're all loving, we're all agapomena lelus over here, right? We're all loving one another. And when we are love, when there is love among us in that sense, then the love of God is being revealed, right? Totally, totally get that. And yeah, I agree, Scott. I totally, um, uh, what is it? Nostra culpa. Uh, English teacher's fault for making us not repeat words in English composition. So true. But anyway, this N Haman N is really important here. Remember all of the usage of in that he's been using, um, with us being in God and God being in us. For instance, us abiding in God and God abiding in us. For the love of God to be in us. Among us does pick up that one idea of like when we are loving, when there is love among us in the sense of like, hey, look, everybody's agapomena lelus over here, right? Everybody's loving one another. Then yes, the love of God is being revealed. The love of God is absolutely a phanerothade when we all love one another, when there is love among us in that sense. But again, the problem is you bring out that sense, but then you lose every other sense. And the most important sense, I think, just in the context of the epistle, the most important, I think the primary thing he's conveying there with that word and Haman in us is the love of God. God is love and God is in us, and therefore love is in us. Love is revealed in us because God is in us and we are in God. And that's true in each of us and in us corporately as well. Both of those places is where it has been revealed that God is in, right? En tuto, in this, ephanerothe has been revealed, he agape to theo in Haman. Hoti, hoti number 3. Hoti ton huion auto, the son of him, ton monogene, the one and only, apostalken, hotheos ais ton cosmon, has sent, God has sent into the world. Hina, so that ze somen, we might live through him. Okay. So much. Big sentence. Um, Okay. I don't even know where to start. Let me start with particular words. Monogene, one and only. Um, it just came to me today. I think I understand why he's saying this, why he brings this up. The one and onlyness of the Son. And by the way, so this is the word you'll remember. We talked about this last time. Monogene, this is the one and only Son. This is the same word that's in John 3:16, which has been traditionally for most of my life and for generations of my ancestors' lives been translated only begotten, right? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Sorry, I'm just pausing and smiling because all of a sudden I'm quoting John 3:16 from the King James in English, and realizing that I think I can place every single Greek word that he's using in that. But anyway, that's fun. Sent his only begotten son, his monogenes son. But recent scholarship has argued successfully that monogene, it doesn't it looks like there's understandable reasons why it was confused with this word gegenetai, um, having been born, which is why where did it go? Monogene was understood to mean mono, one, like only, gegene, only begotten, only born. Um, and so that's where the translation only begotten son came from. But that monogene doesn't actually mean that. Like the gene part is not, it looks like gegenetai, but it's not, in fact, the same word, the same Greek word. However, I think that in this case, John is uh, being playfully unhelpful to future translators by the fact I think he's playing on the sound similarity of those two words. He's just talked about how each of the loving ones are gegenetai ektutheo, are born of God. We're born of God. And then he talks about his son, God's son. The love of God has been revealed among us that his son, huion ton huion auto, his son. Wait, aren't we all born of God? Aren't we all gegenetai ektutheo? But and now we're talking about his son. I mean, like we are? No, no, no. His son, ton monogene. I think that monogene and gegenetai, he's playing on it, right? He's like, no, 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 no. Not the way in which y'all, each of the loving ones, have been born from God. But God sent the son of him, the one and only son of him. Is there a likeness between us and Jesus in our relationship with God? Yes. We are also the seed of God. Remember, this is if we go back, oh no, not from 3. If we go up to paragraph 9, our favorite sin paragraph. Remember, we got this here. No one who is born of God does sin, because his seed abides in him, and he cannot sin because he is born of God. By this, the children of God and the children of the devil are revealed. The one who is born of God, that being born of God and being God's seed abiding in him, right? He's already playing there with this idea of our coming from him, our being the seed of God, our being the children of God, but also there's this idea of God's seed in the sense of his son, the son of God, which he just used in the previous verse, right? The son of God appeared for this purpose. Oh gosh, look at it. It's connecting being born from God with the concept of the Son of God, the unique Son of God, the one and only Son of God. And not only that, in the context of talking about for what purpose the Son of God was revealed, to destroy the works of the devil. So just as God sent the one and only Son of him into the world to destroy the works of the accuser, that we might live through him. Hina ze somen diauto, that we might live through him. So again, there's another one of those examples, right, where you take the two things and the two of them enrich each other so much. What was he talking about when he was talking about destroying the works of the accuser? Well, there are some things that we got from it in that immediate context. Now we can gain another one, right, that we might live through him. The way in which loving and also living are being kind of brought together as part of our identity here in being connected to God, turns out to help us to understand what it means to destroy the works of the accuser, which helps us to understand what the accuser is all about and the children of the accuser, and therefore the cosmo. Oh, wait, except we're talking about cosmo in this sentence too. Because God, Theos, has sent his son, his one and only son, Ais ton cosmon, into the world. Just like those false prophets were sent out, Ais ton cosmon, into the world earlier on in the previous paragraph, right? So that we might live through him. This is aorist subjunctive. Oh, yes. Thought so. So that we might live through him. And so, yeah, that's a Hina. Hina, not a Hina, so that, right? Hina, I think, is easier. It's at least easier in the sense that Hina seems to be used in fewer different ways, as far as I can see. Maybe I'm wrong. But so that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Hoti is complicated. Hina is simpler. You count 23 Hotis in First John? I totally believe it. And in their own way, I love every single one of them. If there's one thing I love more than John's prepositions, it's John's conjunctions. It's all in the conjunctions and the prepositions, man. You understand those, then you get the whole shape of his thought, right? The nouns and verbs are nice, but the prepositions and conjunctions are where the action is. Okay. Speaking of which, so let's see if we can put this whole sentence together then. In toto, in tuto, in this. Remember this love stuff that he's just been talking about. Love is from God. Each of the loving ones has been born from God and knows God. The not loving one has not known God because God is love. In this, ephanerothe, in this has been revealed the love of God among us. Now, okay, so the question is in tuto. Whenever you got in tuto, you got to figure out which direction it's pointing, right? It's a demonstrative pronoun. Demonstrative pronouns point. That's their job, right? So a demonstrative pronoun in this, in what, where? Like, what are you pointing at, right? Demonstrative pronouns point this and that. So what's it pointing? Is it pointing back in this stuff that we've been talking about, which is one of the reasons he often uses in tuto? But we've seen him do it the other way too. And I think this is forward pointing. In this has been revealed the love of God among us. Hoti. That. So see, notice how Scott, he's not using Hoti to mean because or since here, right? Exactly. Randall was just saying the upcoming Hoti implies it's pointing forward. Exactly. The literal translation, like the word Hoti is the word that. But of course, we use the word that in a lot of different ways, right? And that's why Hoti is complicated. In this has been revealed the love of God among us, that the Son of Him, the one and only, has sent God. God has sent. We can't do it that way in English because the grammar doesn't work at all because we are not an inflected language. Um, I'll come back to the word order, but for now, let's just make sure we're understanding the sense of it, right? Um, in this has been revealed the love of God among us. In what? Show me the revelation, John, of the love of God among us, the love of God in us. What is the revelation of the love of God in us? That God has sent his one and only Son, Eiston Cosmon, into the world. Hina, so that we might live through him. Randall, remind me, I know we talked about Dia last time. That's like through by means of, like, so Hina ze soman di autu means like we might live. He might be the means by which we might live, basically. Yeah, yes, because it's got the genitive, right? I remembered that we talked about this. Okay, so since autu is in the genitive, through him means by means of him. Yeah, through or by means of him. Okay, so why? God sent his Son into the world. God sent his Son into the world. Why? Notice, by the way, on the one hand, this seems like an opposite, a different use of the word cosmon. Remember, we talked about these two different senses, it seems. One is when cosmos is sort of generically referring to like all of the people, right? Everybody, like the whole world, like as you know, we might say the whole world, right? Meaning all the people in the world, or like vaguely. Sometimes cosmos seems to be that. The number one example that seemed so clearly that was way back at the end of paragraph 2, right? Um, the propitiation for our sins, and not for ours only, but also for the sins of the whole world, of the cosmos, the whole cosmos, right? There's that. Similarly, the John 3:16 usage, right? God so loved the world, the whole world, everybody, right? That he gave his one and only Son. Okay, so there's that, and but then of course there's the paragraph 6 usage. Don't love the world or the things of the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. The agape ton patron is uh, in conflict with the love of the cosmos. So we have the cosmos meaning generically everything, and we have the cosmos meaning specifically that part of everything which is in opposition to God. But I think we can see here a kind of a quasi unification almost up here in our paragraph 13. Here's what I mean. When God sends his one and only Son into the world, on the one hand, it's not just saying among the enemies, right? It means into the world in which everybody lives, right? Just like he sent him to be the propitiation of the whole world. That's why he sent him into the world, right? So he could be the propitiation for the whole world, right? But at the same time, the word ice, it's all about the prepositions, right? Ice, into, seems to me important. Into the world. As if it is foreign territory. Like as if we're being asked to imagine God being over here and the world being over there. And God sends, I mean, it's motion into, like you're going into a house, right? Or you're entering a city, you're crossing the city lines. So, and I know that saying it as flatly as this would seem to introduce a theological problem, right? Trying to get too upset about that for a moment. But what I'm saying is the use of the word ais is almost as if he is suggesting God is not there, right? Um, it's not like God, who naturally is everywhere and so therefore is also in the world, brought forth his son, right? And yeah, that's true, but that's not the language that John is choosing to use here. Apostolken has sent. Did we use having sent forth in Matthew? Oh, send them away. The demons are asking, the unclean spirits being asked to be sent away into the pigs. Yeah. Um, that Jesus sent out the 12. Yeah. Behold, I send you out as sheep among wolves. He who receives me receives him who sent me. Behold, I send my messenger before you. Yeah. Yeah. Um, all of these things have, oh no, I'm skipping ahead to Matthew loves this word. Uh, I want to peek ahead at John. I know I'm always like in Matthew and John when I look at these things, but um, because I don't want to spend all day long just looking at these. But okay, here we go. Was a man sent from God. The Jews sent him to the priests. They had been sent from the Pharisees. Well, that's three really interesting examples, none of which are totally identical. Um, yeah, it's more than simply send. Randall says there's a separate word for send, stello, apostello, um, something more like commission. So the apo, yeah, that's really interesting. So apostello, which obviously this is the word that that apostle comes from, right? The sent ones. Um, uh, back to, hang on, yeah, because I got to, let's go up to this is what I want on the left here. Okay. Apostello. So you got stello, which is just sent. Right. Meaning send forth as a messenger with a commission or something. Yes. Okay. So, right, there's an undertone of representation. Right. Okay. Um, or like emissary. Yes. I'm now scanning back through Matthew's usages again. Yes, I see. Apo. What's the apo from? Aha. Right. See, it's all about the prepositions. So the apo at the front of stello is from, to send from. Yeah. Emissary. Right. Right. Naturally. Okay. But I bet you it could also be in a more purely physical sense, like to send away. Oh, I was just about to say that. Yeah, send away or dismiss. Right, right. But if you dismiss somebody or send them out, you like kick them out from your presence, right? Um, that's also being a kind of emissary as well, right? Yeah, yeah. Okay. All right. Good. Makes perfect sense. See, just find the preposition and the rest of it comes naturally. Okay. So back to our sentence. It is in this sense that God sent as a representative, as an emissary. I think clearly in this case, he's not dismissing his son, but he's sending him forth as a representative of himself, eis ton cosmon, into the world. Again, not trying to say heretically that, God is not everywhere. I'm just saying that the construction here is of God sending him out into the world, which seems to him. My point was that the word cosmon is kind of capturing both senses here. I don't think it's an either or kind of situation necessarily. Um, into the cosmos in the sense of like for everybody, right? He was apostolic out for everybody, sent for everybody, but also into the cosmos, into the world, in the sense of he was sent out into hostile territory, as is tolerably well demonstrated by what happened to him when he got there, right? This is why he ended up crucified, because he was apostolic and eiston cosmon, into the world which is in this sort of relationship with God that is described back in paragraph 6. Do not love if anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him, right? Okay. In tuto, in this has been revealed the love of God in us, that God has sent into the world his one and only Son, Hina, so that we might live by means of him. We might have life. And I remember I looked this up too. I'm just refreshing myself. Um, yeah, this is just live, to be not dead, not of the dead, but the living. Yeah, you are the living God. Um, while he was yet alive, before he died. Yeah. So this is a very basic, like to have biological life verb, so that we might live by means of him. So in the end, that's a pretty good answer to the first question, isn't it? Why should we love one another? Loving one another is A, hard, and B, kind of lame sometimes, and I'd really rather not most days. Why should we love one another? Convince me. And you could say in the end, his answer is, well, do you want to live? Okay. Let's go back to Agapom and Eleus then, right? Do you want to have life? Yeah. Well, if you want to have life, how do you have life? What does survival hinge on? Survival hinges on him, by means of him, by means of his Son, who was sent into the world. And the sending of his Son into the world is the ephanerothe, the revelation of he agape to theo, the love of God in Hamin, the love of God in us. That we might live by means of him. And if we're living by means of him, we are revealing the love of God in us. And the love of God in us means we are born of God and we know God. And if we are born of God and we love God and God is love, then we ought to agapom and allelos, QED, right? That all hangs together really well. Last note about word order. I said we come back to word order because I think, and if I remember correctly, Randall, you were confirming this last time, that the word orders is wonky. Well, I won't say wonky. That makes it sound like he did it wrong. Is unusual. That he puts the object first, and that isn't normal. And we've already seen that, like ton theon, the object of the verb gnoske, comes after the verb, right? Gnoske ton theon. We just did that right there, right? And then he did it again. The not loving one, not egno ton theon, has not known God. So twice in a row, he has the verb gnosko and then the object God, and he puts the object after the verb, right? Because that's like sort of normal. But then he switches them. In this has been revealed the love of God in us. Hoti, that. The Son of Him, that's the object. And yes, I agree. Yeah, Randall says it's especially odd when the object comes before and the subject comes after, which seems to emphasize the special order. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Um, that Hoti, God sent. So I was switching it around so that it works in English because you can't say it in English this way. And it English automatically changes the meaning when you say the Son of God has this, the Son has sent God, right? Is literally the order. Um, but he switches it. He switches it, showing that it's the object here that matters. Not that God, the subject, isn't important, right? But he's been talking about God and the nature of God and how God relates with us. And what he is plainly shining the light on here is the object, his Son. Right? The spotlight is on Jesus here. Jesus is the answer. Julian, Son, is the one word answer to the question, how has the love of God been revealed in us? His Son. What did God do with his? What happened to the Son? The Son was sent out as an emissary or representative. Who sent him? Oh, FYI, it was God who sent him. Where did he send him? Into the world, right? But that's like the kind of the hierarchy of importance that his word order places here, right? You're right, Scott. If you just read out the transliteration in English in a Yoda accent, then you will convey it effectively. That is true. Um, yeah, yeah. Um, in this has been revealed the love of God in us. That, sorry, what was just striking me? He doubles down on it. That is, arguably, God as a nominative, like as a subject, grammatical subject, does two things in this sentence. God has revealed his love in us, and God has sent his Son into the world. And both times, John has like kept the spotlight off of God. The second time by reversing the order and pushing Hotheos almost to the end of the clause, right? And the first time is by using the passive voice and taking it out entirely. In this has been revealed. By whom? By God. But he doesn't even say that. He just uses the passive voice. He could have said, in this God has revealed his love among us or in us. I keep reading the orange letters, and even when they're wrong, I'm going to write asterisks next to them. Okay, wrong is strong, but you know what I mean. Okay. Like theoretically, he could have put it in the active voice. That was in his power. In this, God has revealed his love in us. Right? I'm 100% sure that a modern English editor would have suggested that in a heartbeat. Right? John, you could really spruce this up a little bit, right? Come on now. Avoid the passive and use the active construction instead. But there's no telling John this, right? John has chosen the passive. And then later on in the paragraph, he chooses to take the subject, which is God, which is there, right, and push it back towards the end. He's not. Why does he do this? What is the effect of all this? The effect of all this, again, it's the spotlight is not on. Had he done those two things, had he put the first one in the active, and had he put God at the forefront, Had he said, in this God has revealed his love in us, that God sent his one and only son. Right? If he'd done that, he could have said it exactly that way. And theoretically, it would have been the same. But the emphasis would now be on God did this, God did that. And that's not what he wants the spotlight to be on. He wants the spotlight to be on the results of God's action. Yes, God's doing all this. The point is, what is it that God is doing? What is it that God is bringing, forth? First, the revelation of the love of God in us. The revelation of the love of God in us. Is God revealing it? Is God bringing it forth? Did God put it there? Yeah, of course. Of course he did. But by removing the subject, by putting it in the passive, what he does is emphasize, almost replay our own discovery of it, right? Like, we experience this. This is what we experience. We experience. It's only later on. Like, we experience the love of God in us corporately, right? When there's agapem and alleluia going on, right? When we're loving one another, we do find that God's love is revealed in us and to us, right? And at that point, we then realize this is all coming from God, in fact, right? But we don't usually start there. And so again, the construction reflects our lived reality in that way. But then also, and by the way, I would say, I think ephanerothe, I said today, and I've said a couple times before, that ephanerothe is one of John's favorite verbs. This ephanerothe is like a leitmotif of the entire epistle, I would say. Things have been ephanerothe, things have been revealed frequently in this epistle. And I think that is what I was just describing is why he uses that word so much. He's describing lived experience in multiple senses. Individual lived experience, when you come to know God and his nature and his love is revealed in you, and then also through you. The revelation that comes from that experience, the uncovering, the discovery. But of course, even also thinking bigger picture, right? Just as Jesus and who he was and what that meant is only a phanerothe to the people around him, slowly and often not completely, right? I mean, just think of all those people who showed up and then went home disappointed, especially after the crucifixion, but even before the crucifixion, right? The revelation, the uncovering, the discovery of who he was and what that meant. And of course, I can't help but think of the road to Emmaus, right? As a real moment of ephanerothe, of revelation, right? Then it was revealed to those guys, on the road to Emmaus, who Jesus was, right? And of course, after that, they ephanerothe that the dude they were talking to is Jesus himself, right? I mean, again, that thing, it's just a big part of the thing. And then, of course, you can think about it even further, right? You can go all the way back to Israel, right? And how God and the nature of God is being ephanerothed to Israel laboriously over time, right? Anyway, This is a digression, semi-digression. But anyway, but again, I think it's thinking through all of this stuff helps me to understand why he's using the passive voice there, why he's um, pushing back the subject of God here. Yes, he's acknowledging that God does all this stuff, but that's not what the sentence is about. The sentence is about what God's doing. That's where the spotlight is. Hoti ton huion autu ton monogene. That a positive, right? That his son, the one and only son, mine. I'm not talking about the loving ones who are born of God now. I'm talking about the monogene, not the gegene type, the monogene, right? I think it's a pun. I think it's a play, which is kind of had an unfortunate effect on scholars for centuries, but whatever. Not a huge deal. But in any case, yeah, the one and only son, apostolken, aiston cosmon, hina ze somen ti auto, so that we might live by means of him. That's why he was sent. By the way, remember what a difficult time we were having understanding what, like, he himself is the propitiation for our sins, and not for ours only, but also for the sins of the whole world. Like, trying to figure, like, what context do we have to understand that? Well, here's one. Here's another one. Sent into the cosmos. Aiston cosmon, the whole world, right? That there's our link. Like the good reason to connect these two passages. And when we do, look what we see. Why was the one and only Son of him sent into the world? He himself is the propitiation for our sins, and not for ours only, but for the sins of the whole world. He was sent aiston cosmon hina ze somen di auto, so that we might live through him, by means of him. So, being a propitiation for the sins of the world, enabling us to live through, to be alive, even to come alive through him. I'm not sure if ze somen, if this is supposed to conjure up a creation image, or if it's supposed to conjure up a resurrection image. I'm not 100% sure it matters. But actually, I think I'm going to go with creation, and here's why. Pneuma, that's why. The breathing of the Spirit. Remember, that's when Adam became Zesomen, right? Adam was a pile of dirt until God gave to him of his pneuma. Well, okay, in Greek, right? Of his ruach in Hebrew, his spirit, his breath, breathed the breath of life into his nostrils, right? And he started to Zesomen, to live by means of God and God's ruach or pneuma, right? That creating us as living creatures, which I think is what he's pointing to here, is fascinating because it seems to be connected with being the propitiation for our sins and for the sins of the whole world. It's time for us to come to life. And the more I think about it, the more I think, like, back to our favorite paragraph, everybody's favorite paragraph, paragraph 9, the sin paragraph. He was talking in exactly these kinds of terms, wasn't he? About being born. No one who is born of God does sin, because his seed abides in him, and he cannot sin because he is born of God. He is born. He has new life. His life that comes from guys. That's what it means to be born, is to have life, right? And the antipathy between having life, being born of God, and sinning is a lot like the parallel between this parallel that I was just exploring between living through him by means of him and him being the propitiation of our sins, isn't it? So much to think about. This is why, by the way, I just want to make it perfectly clear. We're never going to finish talking about First John. Like, we'll come to the end and we will eventually stop. Like, that's going to happen. But we'll never be done, right? The more you continue to, like, every time you read it, this will happen again. And you'll see more of these connections and it'll be more and more awesome. So cool. Okay. All right. I'm good. All right. So we did the first three verses. Not bad. Next time I want to look at where are we? I want to look at the next part of it. In this is love. In this. Are we in tuto again? Yep. In tuto. Two verses in a row that start in tuto. Gotta love it. And both translated in by the interlinear. Getting spoiled now. Okay. Good. So we'll start with the next in tuto next time. In this is love. All right. Yeah. We'll see. Maybe we'll do 10 through 13 next time. We'll see how we go on. All right. Awesome. Yeah, Stephen, you absolutely should keep thinking about that. Stephen is thinking about Romans 5:19. For as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so by the obedience of one shall many be made righteous. Yes. Especially since righteousness is one of the other things that John's been bringing in here from paragraph 2 and then again very strongly in paragraph 9. And yeah. Yep. And with all the parallels with Genesis and thinking about Adam and Jesus. Yep. Absolutely. Okay. Yes. Scott is looking at the rest of verse 10, and this is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us, and is expecting that there are more Hotis in our immediate future. I kind of suspect you might be right about that. I can't stand it. Oh, there it is. Oh, Hoti, Hamais, al Hoti. There you go. Look at that. Now we get to look at Uk Hoti and al Hoti, not that, but that next time. Ooh. So much fun. More elegant Greek structure by John in verse 10. So cool. All right. Awesome. Thank you all so much. Again, next time we'll start at verse 10 and go through. I'm going to see if we can do 10 through 13, just kind of the overview, and then we'll see how it all fits together, or maybe we'll only just do 10 and 11 and 12, or anyway, like we did 7 through 9 tonight. But this has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much. And I will talk to you guys next week. Bye now.